Whether you love it or hate it, an Alabama rig is one of the most efficient ways of catching not only a lot of fish, but a lot of big bass. Now, when this thing first came out, you used to be able to just cast it out there and reel it straight back into you, put whatever bait you wanted to on it, and you could catch a lot of fish. Now, over the years, a lot of bass have seen A-rigs. And nowadays, there's a lot of small little nuances within this bait that I think if you understand, it can really help you to catch a lot more fish with it. So in this video, we're gonna talk about 5 big tips when it comes to fishing the Alabama rig. So stay tuned, it's gonna be a good one. This video is brought to you by Fin Fishing, which is my apparel brand. We are closing in on the end of the year, and maybe you guys are looking for a gift for your son or your buddy or your dad, whoever it may be. I highly suggest checking out Fin Fishing. I run a lot of sales throughout the year. I will have a lot of sales going into the end of the year. So whether you're looking for a sun shirt like this one of the only ones made in the US, a waterproof duck hat, shorts, whatever it may be, I highly suggest checking out Fin Fishing. I will leave links down below in the description. It is the best way to help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel. Now, tip number 1 when it comes to fishing an Alabama rig, set your bait up for success. One of the most important things that you guys should remember when it comes to fishing this rig is that every state out there actually has different laws associated with this rig. You know, some states across the country will allow you to put a hook on each wire that comes off your A-rig. The state where I live here in Ohio actually only allows you to put 3 hooks on your A-rig. Now, a lot of A-rigs out there on the market come with 5 or 6 or even more wires on them. So that means that if you live in a state like myself here in Ohio, which limits the amount of hooks that you can put on there, you're gonna have to set up some of those wires with jig heads. You're gonna have to set up some of those wires with dummy baits themselves. Now, making sure that you have a hook on the right wire is very, very important, because over the years, I have fished this bait an awful lot, and a couple things that I've noticed when it comes to fishing this bait is that the bass are gonna hit basically one of 2 different wires on this bait. They're either going to hit the bottom wires. For example, on this A-rig, there's actually 2 different wires that they might hit, or they're going to hit that wire that kind of trails behind the rest of the bait. For example, in this one, it is this middle one. So when it comes to me actually setting up this bait, I need to make sure that I am putting the jig head on either that trailing wire or the bottom wires, and never put the jig head on the top. Real quick, wanted to butt in from Future Tyler, who is editing the video, because I kind of wanted to elaborate on what I just talked about. There are some Alabama rigs out there in the market where each wire of them is the exact same length. And if you were to take that basically Alabama rig and put jig heads on the top, what's going to happen in the water is that bait is just going to flip upside down, and it may look the exact same because all of those arms are the exact same. But for some A-rigs out there on the market, kind of like this one that I'm holding right here, the top wires are actually quite a bit smaller, and it's meant to come through the water column in a certain way. So if I were to put jig heads on top here, it flips this bait upside down, and it doesn't necessarily make the bait run the way that it's meant to be run. So I just kind of wanted to elaborate on that so you understood exactly what I meant by on the top versus on the bottom. And the big thing here that you should realize is that bass typically like to feed upwards. So they don't typically come from above this bait and hit it down. They actually come from below the bait and hit it up. That is why they typically get the bottom ones over the top one. So when setting up this bait, make sure that you put the dummies on top. Also, something that's very important to understand about the A-rig is the jig heads that you are using. Now, like I said, there's a lot of different A-rigs out there on the market. You will have some A-rigs that have a single hook that is on the very bottom. And if that is the case, I like to have my heaviest jig head on the bottom. An A-rig like the one that I'm holding right here, it actually has 2 hooks on the bottom and a single hook in the middle like this. I really like to have these bottom hooks be the same weight. It kind of keeps this bait even keeled as it is coming through the water column. And I will even make that middle jig head a little bit lighter, so that way, again, it doesn't rotate or spin in the water. It kind of comes in on a very even keel. Tip number 2, gone are the days of just reeling in an A-rig. And what I actually mean by that is, like I said kind of in the intro, when this thing first came out and the bass had really not seen the thing, you could just cast it out there and reel it back pretty much at any pace and catch fish. You really didn't have to do a lot. And yes, there are days and there are conditions right now, even in today's world, where you can do that exact same thing. You can cast it out, you can reel it, and you can catch fish. But what I've seen over the years is that there's a few nuances when actually retrieving this bait that really help to increase the number of bites that you get. Now, nuance number 1 is simply speed. What I have found over the years is that a A-rig actually burning below the surface of the water can catch you a lot of fish, or whether it's below the surface or down there on the bottom. You know, I have fished A-rigs in 25, 30 foot of water, and when I'm fishing them really deep, sometimes again, speed is the deal. So what I have to do is use really big jig heads. Sometimes I'm using 3/4 ounce jig heads on my A-rig to get that bait down and to keep it down when I'm actually trying to reel it really fast. There are also days, especially when you're fishing in really cold water situations, where slowing that bait way down, putting really light jig heads on it to kind of let that bait hover, can also be a really big deal. So always play with your speed. Sometimes it just comes down to experimenting and seeing where you are getting bites. Now, nuance number 2 when it comes to fishing this bait is I truly believe it's kind of like a chatterbait or a spinnerbait, where sometimes a subtle little pop in the rod tip can go a long, long way. Now, I know that not everybody loves forward-facing sonar out there, but what we have learned from forward-facing sonar is that a lot of bass will follow these baits, and they will follow them for a very, very long time. And if you're just simply retrieving that thing all the way back to the boat at the same pace, a lot of times those fish just never engage fully with the bait. So sometimes what you got to do, simply pop your rod tip. And you don't need forward-facing sonar to do this. You could throw an Alabama rig in a pond and still catch fish doing this. What I like to do, I'm going to cast that bait out, and every now and then, probably 3 or 4 times in the middle of the cast, I'm going to pop that A-rig. Literally just pop it. It collapses these wires. They spring up, and it just helps engage those fish. It helps them to trigger onto the bait. And you will find days out there where you cannot catch a fish just reeling it or even speed reeling it. But if you pop it, you will have those fish absolutely come unglued on it. So whenever you're out there fishing this bait, don't just reel it in. Think about the speed and also pop that bait from time to time. Now, tip number 3 when it comes to an A-rig, add a target. Or what I like to do a lot of times, add some sort of accent lure to the rig itself. If you can see here, the Alabama rig that I'm holding, basically I have the exact same color baits on the very top and on the very bottom, but you can see this one that kind of hangs a little bit further back. It's a slightly different color. It is more of a chartreuse color instead of the just normal electric shad, which is what I have on the rest of the soft plastics. And I really like to do that when I'm fishing an Alabama rig. I like to have what I call an accent bait. I like to have one that is slightly different than the other ones. And the reason being is that simply I like to give these bass some sort of target. When they rush up there on the bait, all of a sudden they're going to be presented with 5 or 6 or even more different lures. Also, there may be blades on there, which we're going to talk about here in just a moment. But there's a lot of stuff going on. And so therefore, I really like to help those bass just have a little bit of a target. Now, you could simply put something chartreuse on there. I've also seen that adding a little bit of red to one of your baits. For example, red on the back of the tail of this can be a really, really big deal. Even with the Sharpie, it could be simply a different colored jig head. You know, there's a lot of jig heads out there on the market that are, you know, kind of your plain lead color, which I actually like. But sometimes using a chartreuse jig head, something that just stands out a little bit so that when that bass gets up there and he starts tracking that bait, he has a target. This is something that we have done for years with other baits. You know, we might use, for example, a red
treble hook on our crankbaits or our top waters. We may even highlight little spots with red targets on our frogs. The same thing kind of applies, and I think is even more important with a bait like an Alabama rig, just because there is so much going on. So use an accent lure or dye a little bit of the tails, a little bit of color. Just give those fish a target when it comes to hitting this bait. Now, tip number 4, when it comes to fishing an Alabama rig, this is something that I think can either prevent you from catching fish or make you catch like twice as many bass. And that is all to do with the blades. If you look at a lot of different A-rigs out there on the market, you will see some that just have a plain straight wire. You will see others that have a lot of these small willow blades. Now, those small willow blades are going to add a lot of flash to your bait. They will even add a little bit of vibration to the bait. They can allow that bass to see it. And like I said, I've seen it be the difference between you catching fish and not by having some of these small willow blades on it. Now, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, there are definitely days where having those willow blades on there is simply too much for the fish. And I've seen this most when you are dealing with a little bit more still conditions. You know, if you don't have as much wind or maybe you don't have as much current in the body of water that you're fishing. I really like those A-rigs without blades on them. Also, cold water. When I am fishing in really, really cold water, you know, in the upper 40s, low 50s, I actually don't like blades on there as well. Now, that probably doesn't apply across the country, but those are just the things that I have seen while fishing this bait. So really pay attention to the blades on your A-rigs. I know it means that you might have to buy 2 of these things instead of buying 1 of them, but it is what it is. It really can make the difference between you catching fish and not. Now, tip number 5, and something that I think is really important, use fluorocarbon with your Alabama rigs. When these things first came out, I'm telling you, everybody was using just straight braid with these things. And guess what? You can still get away with using straight braid a lot of times with your A-rigs. I don't necessarily think that the bass are going to see the braid and deter from the bait. Like you're literally throwing a chandelier at them. So I don't think that the braid actually has anything to do with you catching fish or not catching fish. But the thing about using braid is that a lot of us are using an Alabama rig with a pretty stout rod. A lot of times a fast action rod, usually a pretty long rod, like a 7-foot, 6-inch rod. That's what I prefer. And when you're using a rod like that with straight braid, you are putting a tremendous amount of pressure on your wire and on your Alabama rig in general, including the clips that come on these things. And believe it or not, I have seen a lot of times, especially with using braided line, where you get a bite from a bass, which when they hit this thing, they absolutely kill the thing. So that's part of the reason. 2, because they kill it, you set the hook really hard and you will straight up either break a snap off, you will break the wire completely off. You really put a lot of stress on these baits when you throw them with straight braided line. So I have really gotten away from using braid with a Alabama rig altogether. And typically now I'm either going to use 20-pound fluorocarbon or 25-pound fluorocarbon. If I'm throwing an A-rig that has really big baits on it, you know, maybe I'm using 6-inch, 7-inch baits, something that's a really obnoxiously big, that's when I'm going to jump up to that 25-pound fluorocarbon. But most of the time, my A-rig setup is kind of like this, a 3.3, a 3.8, a 4.8-inch Kitech style bait on the back. And in that situation, I'm basically just using 20-pound fluorocarbon. You have plenty of power to get a good hook set in with 20-pound fluorocarbon. Also, you will really help your bait. You will get more bass out of a single A-rig if you use fluorocarbon instead of braided line. So try fluorocarbon. Now, we are here getting into some of the cooler weather months of the year, and that's when an A-rig really starts to play. There's also some other lures that really play in cold water temperatures, and I'm going to leave a link for one of my favorite ones right up here. So if you guys enjoyed this video, I think you will like this one. Don't forget to subscribe. I will see you guys in the next one.